Petronius with Compact for America on CFA Live, and I'm proud to have a professor and now chairman of the History Department of Western Connecticut State University, Dr. Kevin Gutzman. And today we're going to be talking real briefly about Article 5, the power to advance balanced budget amendments from the states, and his thoughts in that regard. Dr. Gutzman, how are you feeling today?
Very well, Nick. Happy to be here.
Well, I'm glad to have you. Now, one of the first questions we often get about Article 5, and Article 5 is a part of the Constitution that defines the amendment power, but a lot of folks say, well, you know, a balanced budget amendment is too much policy. It's not the kind of thing that is really best tackled by a constitutional amendment. We should leave it to the ordinary political process. What do you think of that, and is there any historical context you could give us in your thoughts?
Well, certainly the history of amendments to the Constitution and of the Philadelphia Convention that wrote the Constitution is not in accord with that view. That is, there are several amendments to the Constitution that have been about far less significant questions than this. And, of course, there are numerous provisions of the Constitution itself that are about far less momentous questions than this. So I think it's perfectly appropriate to say if we have an amendment about banning the poll tax or about giving the District of Columbia electoral votes in the Electoral College, or if we have a requirement in the Constitution that members of the House of Representatives be at least 25 years old, then we can amend the Constitution to say that we shouldn't be saddling our children and their children with unpayable debt.
So why did the founders give the federal government unlimited borrowing capacity? What was in their heads?
Well, I don't think that the idea of something like the Federal Reserve with an endless capacity for just printing paper was what people had in mind. We see, if we look at the unamended Constitution, that it says essentially two things about money. One, that the Congress will have power to coin money, and secondly, that the states will no longer have power to print money. Notice there's nothing in there that says Congress can print money, and there certainly wasn't the idea that the Congress would be able to borrow limitless gold or silver. So I actually don't think that the current scenario was one that people contemplated at the time of writing the Constitution.
Well, let me push back a little bit on that. Didn't Alexander Hamilton happen to like big centralized banks?
He did like the idea of a bank, and he did like the idea of borrowing money from a bank, but even a bank that could have a fractional reserve system wasn't going to be able to loan money endlessly. And what we have now is a situation in which, you know, with QE zillion, the Federal Reserve can just make money limitlessly. There's really no end to the extent to which we can saddle posterity with the cost of our own self-indulgence. And this is really not something that's consistent, I think, even with Hamilton's views. You know, Hamilton himself was much interested in what he called posterity. And it seems to me that our current debt binge is all about not caring at all about posterity. So it's really an alien kind of system as far as the context of the 18th century is concerned.
So in a lot of ways, the Constitution has gotten loose from its moorings, perhaps without following the intent, or at least the anticipation of the founders. Is this the sort of thing that you think the founders would have thought the Article 5 Convention was designed to handle?
Well, certainly. It's exactly what somebody like George Mason had in mind in saying, well, we need to have a provision for a state-initiated amendment process because Congress could be the problem. If Congress could be the problem, I don't know even what theoretical case of Congress being the problem one could concoct that would be more classic than the current situation. Would essentially have members of Congress just, again, running up the credit card endlessly in order to obtain for themselves popularity with their present constituents. So I think it's perfectly apt.
Now, of course, you've heard about folks who are concerned about using a convention under Article 5 to propose a balanced budget amendment, and they talk about the risk of a runaway convention. What are your thoughts of the risks of using the convention process to advance a federal balanced budget amendment?
Well, I guess there are three separate things that come to mind there. One is, of course, Congress itself can propose an amendment anytime it wants. It can propose as many amendments as it wants, and nobody says, well, since Congress can propose any amendment it wants, we should never have Congress meet, because it could be a runaway Congress. It could be just a constant amendment proposing mechanism. We actually know that there are about 100 amendments proposed in Congress per Congress, and nobody has ever said that this is a good reason to abolish Congress. Oh, maybe we should think about that. A second point, of course, is that in case amendments were proposed by a convention, those would just be proposals. So again, if the people in the convention were to propose an amendment that said every member of an Article 5 convention gets $10 billion and his kids are lords forever, there's no reason to think that that would be ratified. I think it's an absurdity. Thirdly, of course, with the Compact for America mechanism, we have a ready-made way of preventing even such a convention from running off the rails. So I really think that this is a far safer situation than having a proposal come through Congress. And again, it's exactly the kind of situation that Mason had in mind in saying there has to be a way that the states can initiate an amendment process.
All right. Well, we often hear from the same folks that are afraid of a runaway convention, and presumably because bad amendments would be enforced. But at the same time, on the other side of their mouth, they say, well, nobody follows the Constitution, so no amendment is any good. Is it true that no amendment is any good?
No, it's totally facetious that no provision of the Constitution has any weight. We know, for example, that there's not going to be a president who's less than 35 years old. Right? We know there's not going to be a bill that comes out of Congress having passed only one house. We know that the president has veto power and he can use it. We know that he's commander-in-chief of the military, and he's commander-in-chief of the military. So if you think about the amendments that actually have preceded the one we'd like to see adopted, for example, the 12th Amendment changing the way that the presidential election system works, the presidential election system has worked in accordance with the 12th Amendment ever since the 12th Amendment went into effect. And there's never been any attempt to say, well, no, we should go back to a different system, or we should have a national referendum on the president, or there's no doubt that that amendment has had effect. There haven't been any poll taxes since in the 1960s we amended the Constitution to ban poll taxes. You can go through dozens and dozens of provisions of the Constitution, all of which are heeded. So on the other hand, it is true that as in the 1780s, imperfections of the constitutional system have become evident, and all you and I stand for is the idea that James Madison stood for in the 1780s, where you have a constitutional problem, you should have a constitutional solution. And sometimes when the problem is significant enough, what that requires is reform of the Constitution itself. There's nothing about this that's not perfectly in keeping with the work of James Madison.
Well, let's talk real briefly about the Compact for Balanced Budgets, proposed balanced budget amendment in particular. Sometimes we hear that it proposes a radical new role for the states in that the states would have to approve within 60 days by simple majority any increase in a fixed debt limit for the federal government. What do you say to those who say that that's sort of a radical new structure in the Constitution?
Well, it's not radical. Actually, what it is a return to the pre-17th Amendment situation in which there was a role for the states in ensuring that the Congress didn't claim too much power for itself, didn't claim too great a role in American life for itself. People who favored the 17th Amendment, which is the amendment changing the procedure for choosing senators from the original system of having the state legislatures choose them to the current system of having a popular vote in each state choose electors. People who proposed the 17th Amendment said that its benefit would be that it would democratize the Senate. What they overlooked, some of them intentionally, but some of them unintentionally, was that the 17th Amendment was also going to eliminate an important check in the hands of state legislatures on the Congress. And for my money, it's a good thing that we're going to go back to a system in which people who are not the immediate political beneficiaries of federal spending will have a role in federal spending. Members of Congress, essentially, you can't lose by always saying, I favor more spending. Look at Barbara Boxer. Has she ever voted against any spending? Look at Nancy Pelosi. Has she ever disfavored any spending? The way you make your way up the chain in Congress is by being the fellow who can always be counted on to favor everybody else's spending proposals. So what to do about that? Well, if we hand a role in this kind of decision making to people who aren't going to benefit from congressional spending in a political sense, that is state legislators, they don't have a vested interest in having there be more federal spending, then we can expect that this behavior of the Congress will cease to be so egregious. Just as before the 17th Amendment, the federal government had a far lesser role, and the reason was that state legislators were not so happy to have state authority be grabbed by the federal government as members of Congress are. Americans vote at a lower rate, that is, fewer people turn out, a lower share of the electorate turns out in American elections than in virtually any other developed country's elections. And why is that? Well, over time, it's because more and more of decision-making is in Washington, and even within Washington, more and more of it is in the hands of courts and bureaucrats and presidents who've said they do the opposite of what they're doing and this kind of thing. And so to revivify the old principle of decentralization, it seems to me, promises to bring back citizen engagement in government. I think it'll have positive effects even beyond the most important effect, which is the moral effect of ceasing to impose the burden of our expenditure on our kids.